welcome back to Fearless Journeys Thriving on Campus. I'm Corinne Jansen.
And I'm Steve Johnson. Today we're diving into an exciting and a very creative topic, how Dungeons & Dragons, or D&D as we call it, can be more than just a game. It can actually be a tool for building resilience and improving mental health.
Whether you're rolling dice to slay dragons or navigating a fictional world, D&D can help players develop problem-solving skills, foster community, and even process emotions.
That's great. And we're not alone today. We have a very special guest, David Lindskoog. He's a registered clinical counselor who incorporates D&D into his therapy practice.
Welcome, David. Would you like to tell our audience a little bit about you?
Of course, yes. Thank you so much for having me. Yes, my name is David Lindskoog. I am a registered clinical counselor in the Vancouver, BC area. So I am fortunate enough to work in a couple of different contexts, one of which is at the Health and Counseling Center at Simon Fraser University, which is in the main campus is in Burnaby, BC. I also have a small private practice where I see people for counseling, psychotherapy on the side as well. But one of the things I've been fortunate enough to do at SFU is run a therapeutic Dungeons & Dragons group. So happy to just spend some time chatting about that today.
Yeah, and it's great that you're here to help us look at how D&D can be so much more than a pastime, which has been around for a long, long time. I think first I saw you do a presentation and it kind of sparked an interest in me and we started looking into this. So I'm excited to see where we're going.
Me too.
All right, so let's start with the basics. David, for anyone who might not be familiar, can you explain what D&D is?
Sure, I'm happy to. I was thinking before giving like a informational response to that, it might be fun just to do a really quick demo. Would you two be open to that?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure.
Corinne's not so sure.
I have never played, so.
I always tell people the best way to understand and learn what it is just to kind of see it, right, and experience it. So I'm going to say that you two are adventurers who have been, given a task to track down some lost villagers from your local village who've been missing for a few days. And you're walking through a misty forest, sort of following a game trail, searching through this area where there had been some rumors that you may have been able to find them. And eventually you come to a clearing and you can see, you sort of peek through the sort of break in the trees and you can see before you a handful of villagers sort of tied up together next to like a very crude sort of campfire. And next to that, you can see a terrifying monster of some kind, just kind of mumbling to itself, sort of picking its teeth with what looks like to be like a fragment of bone or something like that. And I'm curious to know if you were in this situation as a heroic adventurer, what your first instinct might be as to what you might do in a situation like that.
Yes, and for myself in a situation, if I was playing something like a black mage, something like that, or what have you, I would probably start with a distraction and see if we can distract the creature out of the area.
Okay. So Steve's character is thinking about distracting this monster, and I'm wondering for you, Corinne, if your character would have any ideas about either sort of contributing to that or even just something totally different.
I also thought of distraction initially. Yeah, trying to get the monster out of there to untie the villagers and
Wonderful.
Get them out.
Okay. And do either of you have an idea of like exactly how you might accomplish such a distraction?
I would probably myself, I think, Corinne, what do you think? I could go on the other side and make some strange animal noises and to see if you could release the prisoners.
Well, and I'm wondering, since you're a black mage, as you said, could you use magic?
Could.
Like make some big, huge ruckus a little ways down in the forest?
It's a great idea.
Yeah.
All right. I love how you're doing some communication with each other about coming up with a plan. We might circle back to that. But one thing about D&D is that we incorporate an element of chance or randomness, and that can also be a really important part about what can make it. It can be a therapeutic lever that we can kind of push and pull and use to our advantage as facilitators. So for this, to resolve this idea, though, what I'm going to say, I don't know if you have a dice in front of you, Steve, or Corinne.
I'm afraid
I came prepared.
Excellent.
I have one. I can roll for you, and you're just going to have to believe me when I say what the result is.
A natural 20.
All right, giving it a roll. It's a 2.
Oh,
so, I'm going to say your attempts to create a big noise. You do make a big noise with this magical spell, but as you're doing so, you trip over a root that you didn't see in front of you in your excitement, and you stumble right into the clearing and attract the attention of this monster, who is now going to probably act in a hostile way to you, maybe run over and in a threatening manner. And we don't have to dwell on this, but generally the story could have gone a number of ways, right? The distraction might have been successful, and you might have been able to go and try to release the prisoners, or maybe you would start a conversation with this creature to try to negotiate with it. Who knows, right? What would happen? But generally what we're trying to do is tell a collaborative story that has an element of sort of unpredictability and teamwork and collaboration. And at its heart, I think, as a tabletop role-playing game, D&D is really about sitting around a table, whether that's a real table or a virtual table, usually with friends, right? Or with people who've at least agreed to all be there for that purpose. And just having fun telling a story, usually in sort of a fantasy world of some kind. We usually have one of those players who is considered the dungeon master or game master. I was playing that role in our little scenario just now, sort of narrating the scenario, presenting the other players with an option to take actions or sort of decide some things that their characters want to do. We then introduce usually the idea of a random generator of some kind. D&D is famous for using the 20-sided dice for this.
Yeah.
And that helps us sort of determine an outcome to these actions without necessarily knowing it in advance, so that the story can kind of proceed in its own way. And that's, I think, the fun part about it, is that we don't know where the story is going.
Right. It's quite natural into going into several different directions depending on, I guess, the dice roll and what the characters decide, right?
And that fundamental game loop of the game master describing a scene, players sort of either asking questions about it or deciding to take some kind of action, the dice, the resolution of that, and then the narration of the outcome of those actions. Fundamentally, that's just what D&D is. Just it loops like that again and again in various ways.
So we're really looking at a storytelling, incorporating kind of a narrative around different things, I suppose.
Absolutely, yeah. And different games take that idea of storytelling or working with a narrative more and less seriously. I think D&D as a tabletop role-playing game strikes a nice balance between, your actions have an impact on the story, but kind of usually in a very direct and easy to sort of understand way. So your action is just like, my character does this, and then the story kind of proceeds, as it would, depending on the dice and so forth. Some other games, when you resolve an action, it's much more kind of zoomed out, and the players are actually kind of describing a major shift in the story itself.
Okay.
But there's lots of different ways that can go.
And Corinne, what do you think, that little kind of demonstration, since you've never played, as you said, how do you feel that? Does it tweak an interest, I guess?
It is interesting, yeah. Yeah, it's cool.
And Corinne and I are both, Star Trek fans, so you can take...
Oh, great.
I do like fantasy, yes, yeah. But like sometimes in the moment, just like with your question, I blank. So I imagine I might like struggle to come up with the next thing sometimes for me.
Yeah.
I've noticed that's a very common experience for newer players in particular is, there can be a little bit of nervousness or sort of anxiety or just awkwardness about this sort of implication that is part of the game that, hey, I can do anything, right? And as wonderful and freeing and imaginative as that can be for particularly veteran players or people who've played for a little while, it's sort of intimidating for someone who, may be sort of not sure, well, what would my character do? Like, what would a good option actually look like? So teaching the game to new players, that's often part of the process is really, hey, your character actually is an adventurer. They are a hero. They would know some things that would be more or less effective here, and kind of helping them to sort of understand what those things might look like. So with newer players and in my group, I often have mostly people who have not played before. The first few weeks of these groups, I am a little bit more active in, just providing suggestions or opening up to the rest of the group. Oh, does anyone have any ideas about what this person's character might be? And what options that might be there for them?
Yeah, so that kind of leads me to kind of that next question is what do you say to somebody who feels really intimidated about role-playing in a tabletop role-playing game like D&D because it sounds too complicated or they're not creative enough or like Corinne said, they kind of get stuck in the thought process. What would you say to somebody like that?
Yeah, it's such an important consideration. Well, the first thing I would want to say is that that's totally normal, right? And it is not an unusual thing at all. I think the people who tend to really gravitate towards this idea of role-playing and role-playing games and have no problem sort of jumping right in to the deep end are usually like the theater kids, right? The drama kids,
Right.
who, they've got some sort of training or is a little bit more comfortable with the idea of improvising or sort of playing a role.
Yeah,
but that's not most people. And
No.
certainly not. There's certainly many, many ways of playing D&D that look very different from that. So that leads to another point here, which is that there's no real wrong way to play a game like this. I think particularly now that we live in an age of D&D being cool, right? And popular, and organizations or sort of like media companies making lots of money and sort of filling stadiums playing D&D, right? Or live streaming their games. And, these tend to be very high quality productions with people who are professional actors. And so there can be sort of these expectations that it has to be this really dramatic, high quality acting kind of experience. And that's really not what most people's experience of D&D looks like in the slightest. I think I go back to that idea, like at its core, it's sitting around a table with a group of friends, just sort of focusing on telling a fun story together. And, when it comes to role playing, that can be the more intimidating part for a lot of people. I would describe, most newer players, I kind of encourage them to begin with what I would call like indirect third-party style role-playing. So it's not like speaking in an accent and, using first-person language and kind of, really embodying this sort of acting idea, but more so like, my character wants to go and talk to this person over there. Oh, great. Great. Okay. Yeah, that's absolutely 100%. Like that's what most of normal D&D looks like. It's not as intimidating when we frame it that way.
Right.
David, you talked a little bit about this, but can you give an example of how a typical session might look in a therapy context?
Definitely. Yeah. I think generally speaking, what I tell people is that, if you're joining a therapeutic group, part of the goal of this format of group therapy is for it to not really feel as much like therapy as a standard group therapy session would feel. So in some ways, we kind of want it to feel like a regular old D&D group. But I think there's also a real value in differentiating from that in some pretty significant and intentional ways. So what I like to do, I follow a model called the Game to Grow model. Game to Grow is an organization in Washington State who have put together a really wonderful training program and certification program. around therapeutically applied role-playing games. So what I do is on most sessions, a standard sort of check-in at the start where we just sort of, spend 15 minutes hearing from people. I like to make sure we hear from all participants about a goal that they have for that session. I usually know, of course, that all of my clients are there for a reason, to work on something. Typically, that's around some aspect of their social functioning. So whether they're wanting to better manage social anxiety or sort of develop some communication skills, social skills, what have you. So I like to remind people of that in the check-in by saying, hey, what is a small thing you want to try to work on today? And we go around with that. And then I also throw in a character reflection question just so we can kind of get to know the characters over time as well.
Okay.
Do a little bit of the role-playing warm-up. Might be something like, what's one of your character's fears, or something like that. After that, in the first few weeks, we sometimes spend a little bit of time after the check-in just kind of teaching rules a little bit. So I might spend 10 minutes or so teaching one aspect of the rules. Or, I know some other colleagues of mine who run similar groups might inject like a lesson around like a skill of some kind, or like a coping strategy of some kind, like a deep breathing strategy, for example.
Okay.
But then we try to get into the therapeutic gameplay as quickly as we can and try to spend, in a 2-hour group, I try to spend an hour to an hour and a half on actual gameplay. And that's the part where I hope that the participant is sort of feeling like it's just regular D&D, while I, as a facilitator, am playing the role of the game master, and I'm thinking about the kinds of scenarios that the group is encountering, sometimes trying to tailor the scenarios or the characters that they're encountering into, the group's goals or a participant's goals. But we're just kind of playing D&D at that point.
Right. So it's like facing some of those real life challenges and incorporating them just into the storyline.
Yeah, and that can either be very explicit in terms of like a particular challenge the client is having, around maybe conflict, for example. I've had plenty of clients struggle with conflict interpersonally. And so when they get to a point where there's enough safety in the group, I might say, would you like to encounter a scenario with your character where your character's in a conflict like this, and see how that goes. So I tend not to sneak up or surprise people with this kind of stuff. But,
well, that's a good plan because you want basically a safe space for it, right?
Yeah, it's a therapy group, and we're trying to be very trauma informed. So there's lots of other things that are a part of that. But we try to just focus on gameplay for that period of time. And then I always save 20 or 30 minutes in the group at the end for debriefing and processing. So we come out of the gameplay at that time, and we're really just focusing then on what came up for people, how were you affected, what did you notice, we're sometimes talking about like what they appreciated about other people, providing feedback to the other participants. So that's a really rich part of the group experience, and I think a lot of people, that becomes their favorite part of the experience.
Really? Okay. So they really enjoy kind of that collaborative end piece where they can actually, in a sense, work with each other in discovering how they felt through the game or how their characters worked through the game.
Yeah, and that part looks a little bit more like a traditional group therapy sort of session would look, where we're really just trying to get people talking to each other and facilitating that. Right. But make no mistake, usually when I say, okay, it's time to stop the gameplay for today, usually people are pretty disappointed because they want to keep playing. But it is really, I always gather feedback about these groups every term. And the debriefing processing is always a highlight.
That's very interesting. I wonder what exactly they might be. It'd be interesting to hear some of that. Let's say the mental health benefits of D&D. What makes D&D such a unique tool for therapy?
I think it's such a unique tool. Yeah. And there's a few reasons for that. One, I think just comes down to the fact that D&D is an inherently social experience that requires a lot of social skills and communication. And therefore it encourages those things if you're having a good experience. So when you think about trying to do group therapy, particularly with people who are, struggling with some aspect of their social functioning, whether that's due to anxiety or maybe they're autistic, or maybe they have other sort of struggles that really affect their social functioning. It's hard to get a group of people in a room together to talk about that, We know that group
Yeah.
therapy is good, right? We know it works really well for these kinds of things, but getting people in a room is often the most difficult thing.
Yeah. And I guess
So,
that's always been a struggle with group therapy, right?
yes, absolutely. So one of the things that's unique about D&D is that it's an applied therapy similar to like in the same vein as like art therapy or music therapy or even like equine therapy, these kinds of things where the therapy is happening in a sort of adjacent way to, it's not like a direct sit around and talk about our feelings type of experience,
Right.
although sometimes that does happen.
Mm-hmm.
It's a fun thing, right? So we get to sort of provide incentive and reward and, help people not feel like it's as much like a normal therapy group.
Right.
The other thing I think that role-playing games do really well is lean on the sort of getting people to use social skills without necessarily like it being a lecture on how to use social skills.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and as we saw in the demo earlier, like you were doing a little bit of collaborative planning with each other, right? And next thing you would have had to deal with is like, oh, we failed, on our attempt to do something. So you get into a little bit of like improvisation, creative thinking, problem solving, distress tolerance, all of these wonderful things that we're usually trying to access in therapy that can be challenging.
Right.
D&D does this in a fun way, and it introduces what we call psychological distance to that equation, which is really useful. So it's not you, Steve and Corinne, who are in that situation where the monster's coming to fight you and you just screwed up your attempt to distract it. That's happening to your characters.
Right.
So we can sort of think about, and as facilitators, often we are thinking about, do I want to like increase the intensity of this situation for the participant, or do I want to help them regulate it in a way by really reminding them in various ways that, hey, this is your character. What would your character be doing or thinking about? Here in the group, in the room, we are all together having a nice, fun time. We're going to regulate that. So that's a part of it as well.
Mm-hmm. And Corinne, you've been involved in some groups, haven't you?
Not therapy necessarily, but yeah, group work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What do you think that some kind of play-like storytelling works in groups like you might have been in?
I think it takes pressure off of the people in the group probably, so they don't feel like they have to contribute. They can focus on the game and then stuff can come out that way, which is really cool.
Yeah, and like you said, David, just that working from a character perspective, right? It's that distance will create some safety as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, to be honest, like role playing as a therapeutic intervention has been around for a very long time. In therapy modalities, right? There's lots of different ways of doing therapy that use role playing in various ways to great effect, right? It's an experiential tool where we can practice new skills, we can sort of work out, potential problems, we can do all sorts of things that just kind of like talking about a situation might be difficult to do. D&D, just does this in kind of a more fun and collaborative way because we're doing it as a group. The other thing I would say is that, there's a sort of the rules of the game and the mechanics that at first seem like an obstacle to many newer players can actually become really valuable strength and support system in terms of like helping people navigate social encounters with more structure, right? It's like, oh, okay, well, I don't have to be this like kind of smooth talking, charismatic person. I can, rely on the rules to take care of that for me, right? All I have to do is kind of, come up with an idea or a suggestion of some kind.
So how does the act of creating a character and their backstory help players reflect on their own personal growth or challenges?
I think it can in various ways. And I always tell people when they're creating a character for my groups, which I do ask people to do, is to think about like, how could your character and their personality and their backstory and their motivations, how could they help you move towards your goals, right? So usually in a group like mine, I'm counting on people wanting to talk to each other. I'm counting on participants wanting to work together and, do that sort of collaborative problem solving and communication and, all of that. There are ways you can think of who my character is that maybe provide more motivation or incentive for that, just as there are ways that might hinder that. A good example of a character concept that can hinder that is the lone wolf character, right? So the character that always wants to go off and sort of do their own sort of secret thing.
Right.
And I have had people in these groups really try to gravitate towards that. But if you think about, like, if your goal is really to talk to more people, work on, maintaining, conversations and, whatever else it is, or sort of like regulate anxiety in social situations, and your whole character concept is about avoiding social situations, it's not going to be helpful. Yeah. So there's a skills element there in terms of like, hey, help, think of like a motivation for your character that's going to help you move towards your goals. But, I've seen some really obviously like thought through character concepts that clearly have a lot to do with like a person's own history.
Yeah.
Often it's like parent stuff or just, family stuff. And it's not like, I usually don't incorporate that kind of thing in an explicit way into like the story of our adventure that we're going on. But I think people do get something out of like identifying with their character on those levels, right? And being able to sort of interact with these themes and these sort of difficult psychological issues with more distance and with more of a fun sort of storytelling approach.
Right. And so basically the character provides them distance, but in creating that character, they're actually putting a lot of themselves into it without really, I guess, purposefully doing that.
Yeah. I think often newer players create a character that we would think of as like a looking glass character.
Right.
This is like the fantasy version of themselves, right? Because, like it's actually more difficult to create a character that's very different from you and to imagine role playing that. Sometimes that happens too, right? I would, say like I've had plenty of people in my groups develop characters who are very confident and very outspoken and even sort of brash or, just reckless, right? And participants themselves are like meek and quiet and, very, like they want to be more confident. So that's another way we can look at that, is sort of as an aspirational type character.
Mm-hmm.
And another common one is like a character that helps the participant explore some aspect of their identity in a safe way. And this has come up a lot for me, and actually in terms of gender identity with participants in my group. I've had a lot of people questioning gender identity or transitioning in one form or another. And they're very intentional about saying, well, I'm going to choose a character that identifies as very masculine and uses he, him pronouns. And, because that's something I'm really curious about. And I just want to try it on in a role-playing, safer sort of role-playing context. Yeah, I've seen that be really helpful for people too. I
think our next question, you may have already answered this. Do you have any stories of how D&D has made a difference in someone's life?
Too many.
Without giving anything away, of course.
It's my own life as well. I have to be honest. Yeah, it's been, I got to say, as a, middle-aged parent, going through a phase of life that can be very isolating and challenging, reconnecting with a hobby that like gets me, in a group of friends regularly, talking about just having fun, like that's something I think that we can lose touch with at this stage of life. So D&D has been great for me in that regard, reconnecting with like a creative side and a social side of myself. But in terms of the therapeutic groups, many, many stories. Often those come from incidental things, right? So it's not necessarily because I've planned some elaborate scenario to really kind of pull off a big therapeutic aha moment. It's really just something that emerges from the story. One example would be, I use a version of a scenario called a fear monster with a group. And this is a scenario in which, the characters, for one reason or another, are facing a monster that is forcing them to face their fears. And so in a very individualized way, each character sort of, we're talking about, what is your character's biggest fear and how would they be kind of facing this sort of monster that's forcing them to do that.
Right.
And I had one character who their backstory was like a sort of ex-soldier, and they had built into their backstory that they had lost a bunch of comrades in their previous life, and their fear was losing more friends. And so it actually got quite emotional for them.
Yeah.
The big piece of this is that the other participants actually started coming in and comforting them, right, and giving all these really encouraging messages. And that was the part that really stood out to them. So, hey, I was actually really going through a pretty emotional scene, and I'm not used to being supported by other people while that's happening. It really helped them process. Like, it turned out to be a pretty significant childhood trauma that they were imagining at that time.
So in a sense, it's really kind of letting players develop empathy for each other.
That can be a really big piece of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Players putting themselves in different roles, like you were saying, it can really, I guess, in a sense, build on that teamwork and empathy. And I guess the hope is then that it relates to their personal lives and they can change some of their narrative then.
This is always the hope, right? Is that we can generalize a positive outcome from the group out into challenges in a person's life, whether that's in kind of relating or connecting to others, or whether that's like about some aspect of personal development. I know, like, having the experience of being appreciated by someone else who's in a similar situation after taking a risk in a social setting can be really powerful. And that's something I often hear about. It's like, well, you know, I feel like I have a little bit more confidence, or, you know, even self-esteem, you know, as a result of that kind of thing. Right. But I think there's also just the exposure therapy aspect of it, right? We're asking people to be uncomfortable and sort of push themselves a little bit in a social sense and move towards something that they're anxious about, as opposed to moving away from it. And we know that, you know, if we're able to do that more, then we habituate to that, right? So the intensity of the anxiety starts to feel less. Right. So we see that too.
That's an awesome thing. So David, let's say someone's listening here now and is really intrigued, but they've never played D&D, like Corinne, never played. How can they get started?
Ooh, yeah. And this is a really excellent question, because I think, like, the hobby is always interested in, you know, growing and bringing new people on, particularly people who haven't really thought about or may not fit that sort of stereotypical mold of, like, the D&D player, right? I think we're really fortunate nowadays to be in a position where, I don't know, there's not as much nerd shame. Right. I think, like, we all, I think, maybe have gone through that. Like, I know I went through that when I was, like, roughly high school and sort of early 20s. So it's kind of cool, right? And we're also in a situation where there's lots more ways of getting involved than there ever have been before. Like, it's not just about, oh, you know, bring it up with your friends or find the club at school or at the library or whatever. Those are all excellent options. Or the gaming store, you know, there are places where D&D is being played, as well as other games in the community that are always looking for new people. Right. But you can also look online, right? There's, as I mentioned before, like, groups who stream their games online and, you know, have audiences, and people can just sort of tune in or watch a YouTube video and see, like, oh, that's what it kind of looks like. Well, that seems kind of interesting or fun. Or you can go to, you know, services now where there are actually, like, matchmaking services for players and GMs. Okay. Some you pay money for, others that are just kind of like, you know, free. Yeah, there's lots of really cool options. Generally, I think the least intimidating option is going to be through something you already have, like, a little bit of a connection to. So again, if it is a club at your school, or, you know, maybe you're lucky enough to go to a school that has a counseling department, where they run a therapeutic group. Right? Like SFU. Right. Yeah. If there's any SFU students that end up listening, hey, just send me an email. Exactly. But yeah, or a lot of libraries are running D&D groups, particularly for youth now. Or, you know, just, hey, you know, bring it up with your friends and sort of see if anyone else kind of is curious.
I think, Karen, I did see our main library here does have a D&D group for teens. Yeah.
I think I've seen that too. And I think possibly in rural libraries too. Like, I'm in Coaldale, I think I've seen it.
That's great. I mean, it's a great way. And like you said, there's some online stuff. I think I've heard, not to plug any online stuff, but I believe one was Roll20, which is, I think, pretty intensive for logging into games. And I think a lot of people use Discord too, don't they?
Yeah, definitely. That's like a very popular, like, platform right now, particularly for gaming, right? Okay. So, you know, see if you can find a server, you know, locally. But honestly, like, if you have a game store in your community, I know like your friendly local gaming stores, like they're always interested in bringing people in, right? And, if you went and sort of asked like, hey, or check out their Facebook page or their website and say, like,
Right.
do you guys ever run like intro to D&D nights or anything like that? And if not, then they, if they knew there was demand, they would probably be interested in starting one.
I will plug our local game store, Showcase Comics, I believe is the one that does promote a lot of D&D and tabletop role-playing games. So I'll
and
plug
D&D
them
right now is, there's a lot of new products that the game stores are probably flush with right now because D&D has just launched its new 2024 edition.
Right.
So yeah, it's a good timing.
So our next question, are there any specific tips for students who want to start a D&D group on their campus but don't know how to find players or resources?
Ooh, I mean, that's probably a pretty campus-specific question.
Right.
So you two may know a little bit more than I do what might work in your locale, but I know where I am here at SFU, there is a club. Right? There's a club, I think they call it Tabletop, and it's not just role-playing games, it's all kinds of board games and other things like that. So, I know that student clubs is probably a one thing to not neglect, right? Always sort of try to look in that direction. Yeah, and your university or your college may have budgets that they allot to clubs, or if you're lucky enough to kind of have spaces that you can book, things like that. You just want to look into that. And resources wise, there actually are quite a few free resources right now about learning D&D. Wizards of the Coast, the publisher of D&D, has a ton of resources through their website dndbeyond.com, including a whole sort of learn to play the game and a free rule book, all of that kind of thing. But there's one adventure in particular that I would want to shout out because it was designed specifically for teaching new players and sort of just starting from nothing. It's called Peril in Pinebrook. You can find that on D&D Beyond. It's like a 10 or 12 page PDF that just walks through like a 2-hour game example. So that's a wonderful resource for newer folks.
So it's kind of like that, what they call it, a one-shot game kind of thing, right?
Yeah, I think the guy who wrote it said it's like this could either be done in like a single sort of 2 or 3 hour sit down kind of format, or like a series of half an hour or 1 hour sort of smaller meetings. So but I've read through it and it's really good.
Cool. And so if someone wants to incorporate D&D into their mental health journey, what do you say to them?
Well, I mean, the mental health journey can mean a lot of things. If the person's more in the sort of, I don't know, like they're involved in their mental health journey to the extent that they have like a professional involved, if they're at that level, then, or if they're looking for someone to support them, professionally for whatever reason, be honest about the fact that you're kind of a nerd, right? Like that's a part of, or maybe it's about video games or something else, right? I think if you can find a helping professional who kind of gets it, then I think that's going to be a lot easier to kind of make that a part of your process, right? I know there are a lot of we call them geek therapists out there who are kind of just interested. There's lots of interesting ways of working with all of that. But familiarize yourself with the game if you've never played before. I think one thing I notice, if you have a good group of whether it's D&D or whatever game, I think you're going to find that it is therapeutic in some way, right? If you're having a good experience. And that might just be from, again, sharing time with people that you like sharing time with in a collaborative and imaginative, creative way. It might be that you get to tell stories that, help you kind of get in touch with emotions or just themes in your life that are, important to you. It doesn't necessarily have to be like, oh, I'm going to go join this therapeutic group, right? There's, I think, a lot of different ways of just kind of, working in your hobbies and your passions into trying to grow and improve yourself.
Right. And I think, Corinne, we always recommend to students, use those things you like to, to promote that self-care. We're always talking about self-care and what that looks like in D&D or tabletop games may be self-care for some.
David, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today. This has been very enlightening conversation. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with our listeners?
Have fun. I always tell people if you're sort of thinking about therapy or any other sort of mental health support, like it can be fun, right? It doesn't have to always be serious and hard. I mean, often it is, and there's good reason for that, but it's okay for it to be fun as well. And I know that's really helped me sort of revitalize my own therapeutic practice.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. That's great. Today's episode, if this has sparked your interest in D&D, its therapeutic benefits, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us, email us at fearlessjourneyslc@leftpolytech.ca with your questions and experiences and even ideas for future episodes. We'd appreciate that. So let's keep the conversation rolling, as we say.
And don't forget to subscribe to Fearless Journeys Thriving on Campus for more episodes like this. Share this episode with a friend, especially someone who might need a little boost in their resilience journey.
And life is an adventure, and every journey starts with a single step, or, as we say with D&D, a roll of the dice. So until next time, stay fearless and let the journey shape your story.